monstrous giants. Some of the most fascinating creatures described in the Bible are giants. There are multiple examples of giants in the Holy Book, with Goliath being the most famous. But the Bible also goes into some serious detail, specifically in the book of Genesis, about colossal monstrosities known as the Nephilim. They were violent superhuman offspring that were created when angels became tainted by their lust for human women in the days before Noah. The thing about the Nephilim was that they were so ugly, heinous, and sinful that God flooded the planet just to get rid of them. Noah then saved the rest of God's creatures with his mighty ark. The Bible describes the Nephilim as giant bullies. They thought they were better than ordinary humans, and their ruthlessness caused the planet to devolve into chaos. The book of Genesis also says that even when they were gone, they left behind a legacy of violence and fear. The Nephilim are an interesting subject because most creatures, monsters, and demonic entities in the Bible can be chalked up to metaphors. The great dragon wasn't a physical fire-breathing dragon, it was a metaphor for the devil, which itself may have been a metaphor for the Roman Empire. But the Nephilim are described as real beings. The Bible doesn't make them seem like metaphors for anything. On the contrary, it very much claims they were real hybrids of humans and angels that existed on Earth at some point in time. Shout to Sean Orr for the super thanks. We appreciate your support of this channel. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Marduk. Marduk is one of the many gods whose name appears in the Bible. If the scripture is to be believed, Marduk was a blasphemous deity that wasn't to be trusted under any circumstances. Historical records show that Marduk was the chief god of Babylon, likely copied from the Greek god Zeus, known to the Romans as Jupiter. He can be seen in ancient depictions throughout Mesopotamia in human form, dressed in fine robes and carrying with him a spade, and a so-called snake dragon. He was also known as Baal, whose name would shift to become Belial later on, as Christianity turned him into a demon. In the books of Genesis and Revelation, the Bible refers to Marduk as a serpent. The Holy Book says Marduk was the focus of idol worship and that he was a false deity. It's his association with snakes that connected him so closely to the devil and helped cement his place in early Christianity as a force of evil. The truth is even more shocking, though. In the Babylonian creation myth, Marduk became the lord of the Anunnaki following a cosmic civil war. Many believe the Anunnaki were a real race of human-like beings from another planet who fled to Earth following some kind of calamity. These otherworldly beings then turned their focus to helping early humans who were still extremely primitive and hadn't yet formed societies. Marduk was supposedly their leader. If all of this is to be believed, it's no wonder Christianity destroyed Marduk's reputation and turned him into a demon. Daniel's beasts. The book of Daniel is a very special part of the Bible that deals with a prophetic vision of the apocalypse. In it, Daniel receives an extremely strange vision that predicts the second coming of Christ and the end of the empires of man. In the forecast of the future, he beholds 4 great beasts, some of the most terrifying monsters in the Bible. The first beast witnessed by Daniel was a lion with an eagle's wings. As Daniel watched, its wings were plucked off and it rose to stand on 2 feet like a man. Then the monster was given a man's heart. This beast was likely meant to be symbolic of the kingdom of Babylon. The second beast looked like a bear but had 3 rib bones in its mouth, clenched fiercely between its teeth. This beast was told to arise from its slumber and devour flesh. This monstrosity was symbolic of the Persian Empire, and the 3 teeth in the bear's mouth represented the 3 empires that Cyrus the Great had already conquered. Then came the third beast. It looked like a leopard, except it had 4 heads and 2 sets of wings on its back. This unnatural creation was likely symbolic of Greece under the control of Alexander the Great. The fourth beast came immediately after, described by Daniel as dreadful and terrible. It had teeth of iron, 10 horns growing from its head, and huge feet to trample the ground. Daniel watched as the beast stomped and broke apart everything in its path. This powerful beast was meant to represent the Roman Empire. The prophetic vision of the apocalypse suggested that these 4 kingdoms would fight against the chosen people of God. In the final days, these beastly empires would be defeated by the armies of the Lord. But if we're taking the book of Daniel at face value, it's been 2,000 years and the four kingdoms no longer exist. Moloch. Moloch is an ancient pagan god that the Bible warned everyone about. Moloch was one of the few gods of the ancient world that could really be considered evil. The cult of Moloch, according to the Hebrew Bible, practiced barbarism at an exceptional level. The Holy Book claims the cult boiled children alive as offerings to their god. Rumor has it there are still devotees to Moloch alive today, and that they still carry out sacrifices in the name of this ancient deity. There are even old depictions of a thing called the Moloch idol. This was a 7-chamber chapel designed in the likeness of Moloch's bull form, with each of the 7 chambers reserved for a child sacrifice. Archaeologists and historians still debate the specifics around Moloch's worship. We know he was a real god of the Canaanites and was likely an enemy of early Semitic faiths. Ancient Judaic texts show that worshipping Moloch was strictly outlawed. Even by pagan standards 2,500 years ago, it seems worshipping Moloch was on the extreme end of the spectrum. If there was any pagan god that could give the devil a run for his money, it was the hedonist god known as Moloch, the army of the apocalypse. There's an interesting modern interpretation of the book of Revelation that you might be interested in hearing about. Revelation 16:12-16 says that when the 6th angel poured out his bowl and the water of the Euphrates River dried, the final battle was to be fought against the kings from the east. Demonic spirits would then rise, and the kings of the world would rebel, resulting in the Battle of Armageddon. Modern interpretations believe the Battle of Armageddon will be fought against China, more specifically, a Chinese-led coalition joined by the Antichrist. This all has to do with the biblical prophecy of an army of 200 million soldiers being unleashed at the end of the Great Tribulation. In the Bible, the soldiers are described as a demonic horde sent to destroy a third of humanity. This is just one part of the apocalypse, which involves things like the stars falling from the sky, the rivers running red with blood, and all kinds of nasty plagues. The army of 200 million demonic monstrosities is just one of many unfortunate things the Bible claims will happen before Christ returns to earth. As for the army being from China, that's a fairly big stretch that's only recently started to gain traction in some religious circles. Traditional scholars maintain that the book of Revelation merely suggests that the armies of man, meaning all the armies of the world, will rise up to fight against the Lord at the end of days. The 200 million demons is just a small part of the horrors that are said to occur during the apocalypse. Do you think the Battle of Armageddon will really be fought against China? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. The Beasts of Revelation. The book of Revelation holds yet another vision of the end of the world, and once again, there's mention of some horrendous beasts, but this time there are only 2. John, who's given a vision of the apocalypse as it will happen, sees 2 beasts rise up out of the sea. The first is an abhorrent thing given authority and power by the dragon, or the devil. It emerges from the abyss with 7 heads and 10 horns, each one topped with a crown. The name of this beast is Blasphemy, and it has the skin of a leopard, the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. As it appears from the sea, a mortal wound on one of its heads heals itself, causing the people of Earth to stare and wonder. The humans are so fascinated by the unholy abomination that they follow it, and for that reason most biblical scholars agree that the first beast is the Antichrist. You might also notice that the beast in Revelation has characteristics of all 4 beasts seen by Daniel in his apocalyptic vision. John's monster also has the 10 horns symbolizing the Roman Empire, showing yet again how much early Christians viewed Rome as a threat against them. It's a little ironic in hindsight, seeing as Rome quickly became home for the church. The second beast in Revelation doesn't come from the sea, but instead rises out of the earth. It's briefly described in the Bible as having a pair of horns and speaking in the tongue of the dragon. This is generally agreed to be the false prophet. In the final days of humanity, both beasts join forces with Satan to fight against Christ, only to be thrown into the lake of fire. The Rahab. In the Hebrew Bible, Rahab is the name of a mystical sea monster. This isn't to be confused with the word Rahab, which means arrogance, or the Egyptian poet by the same name. Rahab is also the Hebrew word for abyss, the dark chasm from which evil is unleashed in the final days of the Antichrist. The Rahab might sound like the Leviathan, but these two beasts aren't the same. In Isaiah, Rahab is described as an ancient monster that rises from the depths of the ocean to pierce the dragon. We know the dragon is the name of the devil in the Bible, so this single passage suggests Rahab was a beast of such great strength, it could fight Lucifer himself. In Job, there's a passage that says, "His understanding he smileth through Rahab," once again implying that the sea monster has the strength of God and can smite his enemies. The best guess biblical scholars have is that the sea monster known as Rahab is directly related to the Babylonian sea goddess Tiamat. In Babylonian mythology, Tiamat fights against Marduk for supreme power over all the other gods. It seems both characters were incorporated into the Bible, and Tiamat was transformed into a Leviathan of her own and set against the forces of evil. The Ofanim. The Ofanim are celestial monstrosities from Christian mythology that are said to be on the side of good. Their description in the Book of Enoch says they're angels of the highest order of knowledge, entities that never sleep, and that guard the throne of God in heaven. But these aren't angels in the way you might be thinking. They aren't men and women with long hair, silver armor, and flaming swords. The Ofanim are almost described like machines, spirits encased inside a series of ever-moving wheels that are covered in eyeballs. The Ofanim are so unusual that it's no wonder you don't see them depicted in a lot of medieval artwork. The Book of Daniel mentions the wheels as being covered in burning fire, with their eyes always watching for any incursion into the kingdom of heaven. Some have even suggested that Ofanim are the wheels of God's personal heavenly chariot. In Christian myth, these things are often referred to as the many-eyed ones. Dagon. Dagon is described in the Bible as a fish god. He's also depicted as a kind of merman. Whatever you want to think of him, Dagon was one of the weirder deities the Bible warned its followers about. He got his origins in ancient Assyria and was the fishy father of another god named Baal, sometimes also called Marduk. Dagon was worshipped by the Philistines, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, and if the Bible is to be believed, even the Israelites themselves briefly fell under the spell of the slimy merman. It's in the Book of Judges that the name Dagon comes up frequently. He is referred to as the god of the Philistines, the same deity they offered up sacrifices to. After the death of Israel's king Saul, the Philistines even cut off his head and then placed it in Dagon's temple of worship. There's no mistaking that Dagon was one of the most popular gods outside the kingdom of Israel about 2,500 years ago. In Assyrian lore, he was little more than a mermaid. Stories describe Dagon as having the upper body of a man and the lower body of a fish. Dagon briefly seduced the people of Israel into worshipping him, but then he was cut to pieces by Yahweh, the Hebrew name for God. Yahweh forced Dagon to bow before him in the Old Testament before cutting off his head and hands. This effectively removed Dagon from the picture. Very little mention of the fish god exists after his supposed judgment and execution by God. In all likelihood, he stopped being worshipped around the same time gods like Moloch and Marduk fell out of favor, roughly 2,000 years ago. The Leviathan and the Behemoth. Few creatures from the Bible get attention quite like the Behemoth and Leviathan. These two monstrosities have intrigued people for centuries, but nobody's ever been able to determine what exactly the monsters were, or are. They both appear in the book of Job, with the Behemoth being described as a creature created by God with immense power. It has bones made of bronze, limbs made of pure iron, and a tail so thick it's like a cedar tree. It's said to live in the marshes and rivers, and has no fear of anything. The Bible even claims the Behemoth is the first among the works of God. There's endless speculation over what the Behemoth could be. The description sounds an awful lot like a hippopotamus that lives in the marshes. Others think the Behemoth is in fact a dinosaur. The third option is that the author of Job was describing a mythological monster that people in biblical days thought was real. The Leviathan is supposedly a creature of biblical proportion that rises from the depths of the sea. It's described as being so big, it can destroy entire ships. Much like the Behemoth, There are a few different options for the identity of the monster. It could be a sea serpent, the legendary kraken, or something as simple as a whale. Either way, these two beasts were so fierce and frightening, they were used as examples of God's ability to create monsters. Mono Bridge. The Mono Bridge in Great Britain was supposedly built by the devil. It's the only fortified bridge of its kind spanning a river, with its gate tower still intact in all of Great Britain. These things were common during the medieval days, when cities needed to fortify the entrances to their towns, but most have crumbled to dust. This bridge has been around since the Roman occupation, meaning 2,000 years ago. And although it has been destroyed in the past, it was always rebuilt. The Mono Bridge standing today was constructed in 1272 to replace a wooden version. The bridge has always acted as a kind of barrier between England and Wales, located right on the border. According to legend, it was Jack of Kent who made a pact with the devil in the 13th century to build the bridge in a single night. It needed to be put up in a hurry, and so the devil got involved to make it happen. The only thing the devil wanted in return was the soul of the first passenger to cross the bridge. But then when the bridge was finished, Jack threw a bone across and a dog chased after it. All the devil got for his hard work was the soul of a mangy mutt. The Devil's Pulpit. The Devil's Pulpit is a rock with a very nasty reputation. The rock was never technically built by anyone, yet it has a sinister connection to evil forces. It can be found in Finich Glen, located deep in the Scottish wilderness. Water the color of blood flows through the glen, a natural phenomenon that makes it look as though the river is being fed by an endless supply of dark red blood. The Devil's Pulpit is a rock shaped kind of like a mushroom, which you can see poking up through the crimson stream. It's believed this rock was used by the devil when he stood and addressed his followers during satanic ceremonies, with the blood-red water swirling around his feet. If you don't believe that, maybe you'll believe some of the other legends. It was said the Druids held secret meetings here thousands of years before the Christian devil ever existed. Some even say the rock is still used by witches today, whose ancestors used the stone as an execution block. Nobody knows the truth behind the mysterious rock. All we do know is that the bloody water is the result of red sandstone in the stream bed. It's like a never-ending supply of red dye. It just so happens that down in the gorge with the Devil's Pulpit, it's dark, creepy, and a perfect place for the forces of darkness to meet. And now for number 8. But first, it's shout-out time. Big thank you to Nick from NY for supporting this channel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already for more videos like these. Chakti Castle. Chakti Castle is a ruin, a sad shell of what it once was. The castle is in western Slovakia, built on a high hill looking over the Little Carpathians at a modest altitude of about 800 feet above sea level. Its rooms have been destroyed, its towers have mostly fallen down, and its walls are full of holes. The castle was built roughly 800 years ago to protect the western borders of Hungary. In 1273, the noble Slovak family of Hont Pazmany lived in the castle when it was besieged by the King of Bohemia, Ottokar II. But then the castle was rebuilt, used once again as a fortification, and new buildings were added. It became not just a castle, but a luxury accommodation. The part of the castle's history most people are interested in starts in 1569. That was when Ferenc Nádasdy became the owner of the castle alongside his wife Elizabeth Bathory. He gifted her the castle as a wedding gift. And if you know anything about the name Bathory, you'll know the castle became one of the most terrifying places in Europe. While Ferenc was away and Elizabeth was alone in the castle, she murdered a lot of people. She was arrested in 1610 and put on house arrest following accusations of murdering between 30 and 650 young girls. She didn't just murder them, but allegedly bathed in their blood. Elizabeth Bathory was so evil, many believe the devil himself had something to do with the construction of the castle. If not with its construction, then the devil at least somehow got into the bones of the structure. Because the way many people see it, nobody could do what Elizabeth did without some infernal influence. She slathered her servants in honey and then watched them be stung to death by bees and wasps. She buried some people alive, threw them in icy lakes, and other things even more heinous. It's probably a good thing that in the early 18th century, the castle was burnt down and never rebuilt. Would you ever stay the night in this creepy castle? The Devil's Bridge. If there is one thing Europe has in abundance, it's ancient bridges. Most major European towns and cities were built around rivers, and so there are thousands and thousands of bridges across the continent. Many of these were purportedly built by the devil. One of the devil's bridges is called Rakotbrücke Bridge, located in Goblin, Germany. It's a fantastic piece of architecture, designed in such a way so that the mirror image reflected off the water makes it seem as though the bridge is forming a portal to another dimension. This was no accident. When it was commissioned in 1860 by a knight from the local town, he specifically asked that the bridge be built with a hump, forming a semicircle with the surface of the water. This created the portal effect he wanted, and caused rumors to circulate that the bridge was built by the devil. The reason so many European bridges have an association with the devil is that people didn't really understand architecture, and certainly not engineering. When something seemed too miraculous to be true, people immediately thought it was built with the help of Satan. The fact that Rakotbrücke Bridge forms a creepy portal in a dense and ominous woodland didn't help it much. The bridge is still standing to this very day. However, nobody's allowed to cross it anymore because it's so frail it might break. If it was built by the devil, he didn't make it to last. St. Mary's Church. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Clop Hill, England, may have been built specifically for the worship of the devil. Historical records show the church was likely built around 1350 AD. For a long time, nobody had any issues with the church. It wasn't until the 19th century that things started to get weird. In 1820, the church was supposed to be expanded because there weren't enough seats to fit the growing congregation. But before that was done, a new church was built in the center of the village instead because it seemed a little easier. The old church then became used as a mortuary chapel, a place to keep fresh corpses before they could be buried in the nearby cemetery. Then came the 20th century and the Satan-worshipping craze that swept across the West. The same thing was going on in England and America, with the supposed rise of devil-worshipping happening in churches. In the 1960s, the church started to take on a bad reputation. Graves were found desecrated, and there was evidence of unholy rites being practiced. That was when it came out the church wasn't even built properly. Most church altars are constructed facing east so that the altar faces the rising sun, associated with heaven. But the altar of the Church of St. Mary the Virgin faces east, pointing at the entrance to hell. Nobody knows exactly what happened when the church was built, but considering the strange situation with the altar, it's possible the church was built purposely to face the direction of hell. Do you think the church altar points east on purpose, or do you think it was a mistake? The Devil's Tower. According to legend, the devil paid a visit to Chateau de Bonneval in the 11th century. The chateau is one of the oldest aristocratic homes in France. It's been a part of Bonneval family history for over 1,000 years. Documents trace the evidence of a structure here to the early part of the 11th century. That was when the castle was built, along with the feature called the Devil's Tower. According to legend, an earthquake shook the village shortly after the castle was built. One of the towers at the residence fell to the ground in pieces. Almost immediately after, a strange and mysterious traveler arrived at the castle and asked if he could spend the night. He was allowed to stay, and later told the lady of the house that he would fix the damaged tower in just 24 hours. But of course, there was a catch. The only way the stranger would repair the tower was if he could have the lady of the house's daughter as his wife. It seemed like such a preposterous deal that the lady accepted. Surely there was no way that a single man could repair a castle tower in one day. But he did repair the tower, and it did take less than a day. The stranger was about to be married when the priest took out a bottle of holy water and splashed some on the stranger and his soon-to-be bride. The very second the holy water touched the stranger, he hissed and spat out fire. It turned out he was the devil all along, just trying to get his hands on a Bonneval daughter. Ever since, the tower has been associated with the devil and his magic. Yester Castle and the Goblin Hall. Sir Hugo de Giffard built the stone keep of Yester Castle around 1267 AD. Not much is known about the castle or its creator, other than that Hugo was an immigrant given land when Scotland was ruled by the legendary King David I. We also know Sir Hugo was allegedly a magician and a necromancer, and that with help from supernatural forces, he raised an army of goblins. The story is truly unbelievable, and yet it's been told for over 500 years. Beneath the ruins of the castle are the remnants of a place called Goblin Hall, a creepy undercroft where Sir Hugo supposedly practiced his sorcery. He was known to locals as the Wizard of Yester, and they were all very afraid of him apparently. Legend has it that his magic grew so strong that he made a pact with the devil through witchcraft. The devil helped him raise an army of hobgoblins, and together they constructed the unbreakable Yester Castle. In local lore, Sir Hugo is a dark wizard who ruled from his castle stronghold. In real history, we know very little about him. His castle was occupied by his ancestors until 1357, when suddenly there were no more male heirs. The castle then began to change hands, moving from family to family until it was abandoned altogether and allowed to decay. And now for number 3, but first it's shout-out time again. Big thank you to Paula Burnett for supporting this channel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Origins Explained family. Our Lady's Church. It was a common theme in medieval Europe for architects and engineers to have the devil do their bidding, then to trick the devil and get away with it. Another one of these tales comes from Our Lady's Church in Munich. According to legend, the builder was having a difficult time with the construction of the cathedral. He was left with no choice but to make a pact with the devil. Whether he had run out of funds or didn't have enough workers, he just couldn't get the cathedral done in time. And so, the devil stepped in to help. The devil provided the funding and workers needed to get the job done. The only condition was that the cathedral should have no windows, that way no divine light could enter. If the architect disobeyed this one instruction, his soul would forever burn in hell. When the church was finished, the devil came to inspect the building. He took one step into the church, looked around, and was furious that he couldn't see any windows. The architect was so brilliant that he had designed the windows to be hidden behind a massive altarpiece and cleverly placed internal columns. The devil left feeling defeated, not knowing that there were indeed windows. If he had walked a little deeper into the building, he would have seen that the builder's soul should have belonged to him. There is still a footprint at the entrance of the cathedral where the devil supposedly stood 600 years ago. The Devil's Well. The Devil's Well in Caprarola, Italy, can be found inside the forest of Monte Venere. It's a protected primeval forest 1,600 feet, 488 meters above sea level. The Devil's Well isn't a man-made construct, but a volcanic cave that goes about 32 feet, 9.7 meters deep, and spans 130 feet, 40 meters underground. The cave is filled with shards of volcanic rock from what appears to have been a collapse tens of thousands of years ago. But there have been other things found in the cave as well, like pieces of pottery from the 5th century BC. Local legend says the cave was the result of Hercules smashing his club against the earth. Hercules hit the ground so hard that water sprang forth, forming the nearby lake. Another local legend says it was the devil who had something to do with the creation of the cave, hence the name. However, it's not really clear what the devil did. It could be that during medieval times, local Italians thought the cave was a portal to hell, put there by the devil to suck away people's souls. The Valentino Bridge. The Valentino Bridge is a picturesque structure tucked away at the foot of the Cahors Cliffs in France. It was built in the 14th century between 1308 and 1378 and is visited by thousands of people every year. It is by far one of the most spectacular medieval bridges in Europe, with 6 massive arches spanning the Lot River. It looks almost brand new, and that's because of extensive restoration work in the 1800s. If the original Gothic architecture had been left alone, the whole thing would likely be in the river by now. But the bridge goes by another name, the Devil's Bridge. According to locals who have been telling the legend for generations, the architect of the bridge made a deal with the devil. The architect agreed to give his soul to the devil if the devil would use his skills to make the greatest bridge in France. Part of the agreement was that the devil had to obey all the architect's orders. Then once the bridge was complete, the architect began regretting his decision. In order to trick the devil, his final order was that the devil collect water for the workers using a sieve, an impossible task. It was a rude trick that broke the contract and saved the architect's soul. In revenge, the devil then had one of his demons steal the final stone in the central tower every night, so the bridge could never be completed. This missing stone really was missing and wasn't restored until 1879. Do you think the devil had a hand in the construction of one of these ancient structures? Bloody Mary. Mary Tudor was the first Queen of England to rule by herself. She's also called Mary I of England, or more appropriately, Bloody Mary. Mary earned herself the ghoulish nickname by persecuting Protestant heretics, killing people in the hundreds. Historians have estimated that during her brief 5 years ruling England, between July of 1553 and November of 1558, she killed 300 people. She didn't just kill them, she had them burned alive at the stake in one of the most brutal executions of the Middle Ages. She went even further than her father, Henry VIII. You remember him, right? With all the wives and the beheadings? But even though he is famous for having his second wife, Anne Boleyn, sentenced to death, he only ever executed 81 people for heresy. But what did it mean in 16th century England to be a heretic? For Mary, it meant being a Protestant. Her father had reversed the religious doctrine of England during his rule, leading to the rise of Protestants and the abolition of Catholicism. But when Mary took over, she immediately reversed it, and in 1555, she revived ancient heresy laws so that she could legally burn people. Hundreds of practicing Protestants fled to Germany and Geneva, where they would later become the Puritans, those who were caught not being Catholics, and those who refused to give up their Protestant ways and become Catholics were martyred in fire. Bloody Mary will be remembered forever thanks to that paranormal game. Bloody Mary is said to have a high risk level, but if you are successful, you will have demonstrated proof of your bravery. There is some controversy as to which Mary it is. It could be Bloody Mary or another Mary named Mary Worth. Regardless, if you light a candle and chant Bloody Mary into a mirror, supposedly you see her ghost. Have you ever played this game? What was your experience? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Elizabeth Bathory. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't a queen, but she was a very wealthy and powerful Hungarian noblewoman in the 17th century. She was extremely well connected. Her uncle was the King of Poland, and her nephew was the Prince of Transylvania. But that didn't stop her from being persecuted as a serial killer in the year 1610. She was confined to her home at Castle Chakti up until her death in 1614. This was after it came out that she murdered roughly 600 people. She's currently the Guinness World Record holder for most victims as a female murderer. She earned herself the nickname Blood Countess, and some say she was one of the inspirations for the story of Dracula. So what exactly did Elizabeth Bathory do to her 600 victims? It all started after she became a widow in 1604. Her husband died and she was left alone. She began to torture her servants and the minor noblewoman within her reach. She occasionally covered somebody with honey and left them outside to be eaten by insects. She forced young women to strip naked and jump into ice baths until they froze to death. She would drive needles into people's fingernails, cut their noses and lips off, and bite people viciously like a wild animal. The only thing Elizabeth was not guilty of was the one crime she's most famous for. Legend has it she used to bathe in the blood of virgins, splashing about in a bathtub filled to the brim with warm human essence. But that never happened, or at least there's no record of it happening. Anula of Anuradhapura. Anula was the great queen of Anuradhapura in the 1st century BC. Historical records from this time are a little fuzzy, but she's believed to have been the first female head of state anywhere in Asia. She was the first recorded queen of Sri Lanka to wield significant power, and she was supposedly a man-eating serial killer. The kingdom of Anuradhapura ruled the island of Sri Lanka from between the 4th century BC until the 10th century AD, with their heads ruling from the capital of Anuradhapura. The city was occupied as early as 900 BC, when it was a little more than a settlement of shacks. But with time, the civilization grew and prospered and became powerful. Queen Anula ascended to the throne after allegedly poisoning King Choranaga. She was his consort, but had fallen in love with a palace guard. After the king was dead, he was succeeded by his son Kudatissa. But 3 years later, Kudatissa also died from poisoning. Following his death, the palace guard Anula had fallen in love with was put into power. But he too was murdered after only a year, after Anula fell in love with someone else. This happened a total of 6 times. Anula continued falling in love with men, helping them secure the throne, and then murdering them once she fell in love with somebody else. By the time she had run out of men to kill, it was Anula who finally found herself sitting on the throne. But her rule only lasted 4 months before she was usurped and burned alive in the palace. Very short rule for all of that work. Have you ever heard of this queen? Let me know in the comments and be sure to subscribe for more videos like these. Karina de Medici. You've probably heard of the notorious Karina de Medici. Karina de Medici was born in Florence in the year 1519. Her father was one of the most powerful men in the world, Lorenzo de Medici, who had Florence in the palm of his hand. Her mother was a wealthy French woman who'd been married off as part of a negotiation between the throne of France and the Vatican. Karina's life started out poorly. Both her parents died within weeks of her being born, and she was raised by relatives. She moved to France at 14, was married to Henry II, and in 1547, Henry was made king and Karina was his queen consort. She and Henry had 10 children, 6 of which survived. In 1559, Henry was killed in a jousting tournament. It was the beginning of the end for the once popular sport of jousting. His son, Francois II, was old enough to rule but was extremely sick. He died a year later, and then Charles IX became king, but he was too young to rule, and so Karina was appointed regent. She wasn't technically the queen, but she did technically make all the decisions and the policies. And this brings us to the horrors of the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. The issue of the time was that the Protestant Reformation had started. Protestants were demanding rights, the Catholics refused, and the French wars of religion were about to get very ugly. A crisis point was reached in 1572. On August 23rd, a group of Protestants gathered in Paris, which was considered a Catholic city. Karina gave the order to kill every Protestant leader. News spread through Paris, people were roused to action, and mob violence exploded. Catholics took it upon themselves to start killing all the Protestants they could find. They broke into their homes, slaughtered them in their beds, and killed them in the streets. By the end of the day, Karina had inadvertently caused the deaths of 3,000 Protestants in Paris, and by the end of the next few weeks, 70,000 in all France. Empress Wu. Empress Wu killed her sister, she killed her older brothers, and she poisoned her own mother. But her ruthlessness paid off. She lived in the 7th century AD and became the first woman in 3,000 years of Chinese history to rule by herself. The empress started from humble beginnings as a woman named Wu Zetian. First she was a consort to Gazyong Emperor, then she was the woman pulling the strings behind her youngest son who took over for his father. Then from between 690 and 705, she was the official monarch. Although she only officially ruled for 15 years, Empress Wu was the one ruling over the Zhou dynasty behind its figureheads for the better part of a century. Unfortunately, the exact details of her life are obscured by the biased reporting of the day. Most people were not happy to have a female emperor, and so a lot of what they wrote in historical records may have been embellished. For example, she was supposedly cruel and lewd. She destroyed her officials, murdered anyone who got in her way, butchered her entire family, and was hated by the gods themselves. Surely there's at least some truth to the allegations put against her. Historian Mary Anderson described some of the crimes of Empress Wu in her collection of imperial Chinese histories. The empress supposedly had 12 branches of an opposing clan killed, had the heads of 2 rebellious princesses brought to her on platters, and ordered the deaths of her own grandson and granddaughter when they criticized her rule. Herm Sultan. Herm Sultan, also known as Roxolane, is one of the most controversial figures in Ottoman history. She was born in western Ukraine either in 1500 or 1502 during the rule of the Kingdom of Poland. She was taken at the age of 12 and sent to Istanbul as a prisoner. She became one of many concubines for Suleiman the Magnificent. But because of her unbelievable beauty and terrific smile, the Sultan fell in love with her. He agreed to free her from her bondage, and for the first time in history, an Ottoman Sultan married one of his former slaves. From this point on, she became extremely influential. She was so loved by the Sultan that everything she said became law. She eventually achieved massive power and influenced all the politics of the Ottoman Empire. She acted as the advisor, wrote diplomatic letters, and died after a long life in 1558. However, she wasn't totally innocent. The Sultan already had children with other women who were older and technically more legitimate for the throne. This did not sit well with Hurrem, who wanted her own children to become rulers when she was gone. To facilitate this, rumor has it she cooked up a plot to make the Sultan believe his sons were planning to murder him and take the throne. She then encouraged the Sultan to execute his own eldest son, securing Hurrem's son's future, Pharaoh Nitocris. Nitocris was likely a pharaoh at the end of the 6th dynasty. However, she may have also been a fictitious person made up by the Greek historian Herodotus. Nobody is entirely sure. The issue is that we don't have a lot of historical records about this woman. The few records we do have come from Herodotus, who was notorious for stretching the truth. The pharaoh allegedly gained power after her brother was murdered. The same people who killed her brother put Nitocris in power. She was silently furious, but accepted the throne with smiles and grace. Then she did something crazy. Right after she became queen, she invited all of the conspirators behind her brother's killing to a party. The party was held in an underground chamber. After her guests arrived, the pharaoh excused herself, locked the entrance behind her, and then flooded the room using a secret duct connected to the Nile River. Every single person involved with her brother's murder was drowned. Afterward, she threw herself on a fire to avoid any kind of punishment or retribution. Isabella of Castile. Isabella of Castile was Queen of Castile and Aragon, ruling alongside her husband Ferdinand II of Aragon. Their marriage was extremely important in the 15th century because it joined the two kingdoms under one rule, a major turning point for the Iberian Peninsula. Isabella and Ferdinand shared power equally, strengthened the monarchy, and dismantled the power that their nobles had been flaunting throughout their individual kingdoms. They were a frighteningly powerful couple who pushed the Muslims back into Africa, reclaimed a territory that had been lost during the Islamic attacks of the past 700 years, and completed reconquering Spain. They were really the foundation for what would become the Spain we know today. On the other side, some say Queen Isabella committed genocide. It's because in March of 1492, the 31st to be exact, Isabella signed the Alhambra Decree. This proclaimed that all Jewish people living in Spain after July 31st, 1492 would be killed. Isabella was also behind the establishment of the Inquisition in Spain and behind a move to convert all Jews or anyone showing interest in Jewish life. Historian Karen Armstrong says that during the first 12 years of Isabella's Inquisition, about 13,000 Jewish people were murdered. And sadly, this was a dark shadow of what was to come in the 20th century. Queen Maeve. Queen Maeve from Irish legend may or may not have been a real person or based on a real person. She was a prominent figure in the Ulster cycle of Irish myth. Queen of Connacht and wife of Ailill MacMarta. Irish myth is fascinating in that many of the characters are not necessarily superhuman or supernatural, leaving scholars to speculate they may have been real rulers. What we know about Queen Maeve is that she was a ruthless warrior. She drowned her sister when she was pregnant out of furious jealousy, and she started a war when she learned that her husband had more stuff than her. Maeve wanted to be equal with her husband, and so the story goes that they compared their belongings. They were equal in every regard except that her husband had a fabulous white bull and she did not. When Queen Maeve went searching for a bull that could rival her husband's, she found one owned by a local farmer. Maeve demanded that the farmer hand over the bull. When he refused, one thing led to another, and war broke out between the tribes of Ireland, all over a measly bull. Ranavalona I. Ranavalona I was married to Radama I in the early 19th century, but after her husband died, she saw it as an opportunity to take power herself. She would have been ousted from power if not for her quick actions. She immediately murdered every person with political sway that could have threatened her. She got rid of the competition and made sure there was no one who could stand up against her. And so in 1828, she was the singular ruler of the Kingdom of Madagascar. But she wasn't a very good queen. She wanted Madagascar to be isolated from the rest of the world, specifically from Europe. She saw what was going on in other places in Africa and didn't want anything to do with it. She crashed Madagascar's economy by cutting ties with Europe. And although she did repel the French when they attacked, she was brutal to her own people. She didn't like the rising Christian movement in her country, and so she squashed it with violence and brutality. Queen Ranavalona was the absolute worst thing that ever happened to Madagascar. She forced her own people into unpaid labor to complete public work projects. She had a standing army whom she sent to murder and kill at will. Her crazy policies led to the deaths of about 2.5 million people from between 1833 and 1839. She wanted Madagascar to flourish, but her isolationism led to famine, widespread starvation, violence, chaos, and the population being cut in half before she finally died in 1861. Who is your favorite wicked queen from history? Polish Airlines Flight 5055. LOT Polish Airlines Flight 5055 was an ordinary passenger flight that left Warsaw, Poland on the morning of May 9, 1987. The Ilyushin Tu-62M Soviet long-range jetliner was supposed to land in New York, but instead the aircraft crashed into the Kabati Woods Nature Reserve less than 1 hour after departure. The accident was devastating, with 183 passengers and crew losing their lives. It was the deadliest accident involving an Ilyushin Tu-62, and it was also the deadliest airplane disaster in Poland's history. The crash occurred because the engine shaft disintegrated due to faulty bearings. There was a catastrophic failure of both left engines, then a fire started on board that burned away the control systems. The terrible tragedy of Flight 5055 can be heard in the black box recordings of the conversation between air traffic control and the pilots. Air traffic control insisted they quickly climb to 18,000 feet, 5,486 meters, but it didn't do much good. The crew soon realized there was something terribly wrong with the plane, and the black box recording revealed the panic inside the aircraft. There were some passengers screaming about fire, while others were shouting, "What's going on?" And finally, after some unintelligible noise, someone can be heard softly saying, "Good night, goodbye, bye, we're dying." Lapa Flight 3142. In late August of 1999, Lapa Flight 3142 crashed after leaving the international airport in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The vehicle failed to get airborne because the pilots weren't paying attention and forgot to deploy the flaps. The devastating accident resulted in 3 crew members and 60 passengers dying, along with 2 people who were unfortunate enough to be on the ground at the time. It was the second deadliest aviation accident in Argentine history, right after Flight 2533 from 1997, in which 74 people died. The aircraft was 29 years old at the time of the accident. It was a Boeing 737-200 with an accumulated 64,500 hours of flight time. The plane had already taken off and landed 38,600 times. The captain of the flight was Gustavo R. Weigel, who was an extremely skilled pilot. First Officer Luis Echeverri was also a veteran pilot with over 4,000 logged flying hours. Before the flight even began, the pilot and the first officer got into a casual conversation with the flight dispatcher over the radio. They talked about the weather conditions and alternative airports to land at if there was a problem on the flight. However, things became a little too casual. Both pilots began talking about their personal relationships and mentioned that things weren't going so well with them in their home lives. Then, when they tried to take off, they crashed. The investigation following the incident concluded the crash happened because of a lack of crew discipline and an excessive amount of conversation not focused on the flight. In other words, the pilots were chatting too much and forgot to do their jobs. Their verbal exchange can be heard in the CVR recording, and it's chilling to think what came after such a casual conversation. Malaysian Airlines Flight MH370. On March 8, 2014, Malaysian Airlines Flight MH370 vanished during a trip from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. There were 239 passengers and crew on board, but none of them have ever been found. The unexplainable vanishing act has resulted in one of the most bizarre aviation mysteries of our time. Nobody knows how the plane disappeared or where it ended up. Investigators don't even have any leads, so it's no surprise that the disappearance of this flight has led to some insane conspiracy theories. One of the most recent theories that started circulating is that the black box recording from MH370 was discovered. When investigators listened to the recording on the box, they supposedly heard a creepy message that said, "Danger SOS. It is dire for you to evacuate. They are not humans. Danger SOS." The message seems to suggest the aircraft was besieged by extraterrestrials. However, there isn't any proof this happened, and it's all just speculation. That being said, if aliens did have something to do with the disappearance of Flight MH370, it would make sense why the airplane and its passengers have been so difficult to find. United Airlines Flight 93. United Airlines Flight 93 was hijacked by members of Al-Qaeda on the morning of September 11, 2001, and there's no black box recording more haunting than the one from Flight 93. The final minutes of the horrifying ideal that those passengers on board suffered through was captured in the Mayday audio call. But first, let's look at the specifics of what happened. Flight 93 was part of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, but it crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The passengers and crew mounted a brave counterattack against the hijackers in an attempt to regain control of the plane. Several people on board had already learned of the attacks in New York City and the Pentagon, and so they decided to fight for their lives. The hijackers stormed the cockpit just 46 minutes after they left the airport. The struggle between the hijackers and the pilot was transmitted directly to air traffic control. The hijackers were trying to crash the plane into the US Capitol building, but the struggle with the rest of the crew thwarted their plan. Instead, they crashed into a field by an old strip mine. And unfortunately, all 44 people on board were killed in the terrible incident. Air France Flight 447. There was chaos in the cockpit when Air France Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean on June 1, 2009. But we didn't know about the chaos for nearly 2 years after the flight disappeared. It was a lot like Malaysian Airlines Flight MH370 because it vanished over the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't until 2011 that the wreckage was discovered, allowing investigators to find the flight data recorders and the plane's black box. The twisted metal remains of Flight 447 was found 2 miles, 3 kilometers beneath the ocean. Researchers soon began pouring through the data to figure out what went wrong. They found that the plane suffered a technical problem when its airspeed sensors became covered in ice. Severe weather then led to a chain reaction of errors that forced the plane to hit the water, killing all 228 people on board. In July of 2011, the full transcript of the conversation happening in the cockpit was released. The recording shows that it wasn't just technical errors that caused the plane to crash, but ordinary human confusion. The pilots became confused when the speed sensors iced over, and you can hear the panic in their voices in the recording. After making a series of wrong decisions to try and correct the problem, they lost control of the plane. Without fully understanding what was happening, the aircraft then hit the water. What do you think really happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button and let us know what other video topics you would like to see. Continental Connection Flight 3407. In the audio recording from the cockpit of Continental Connection Flight 3407, there isn't anything particularly alarming, at least not at first. The black box recording from the doomed Buffalo flight reveals the captain and his first officer chatting casually as ice began to form on the windshield and wings. They made light, nonchalant conversation about the concern they shared for flying in such brutal winter conditions. Minutes later, pilot Marvin Renslow can be heard saying, "Jesus Christ," and then his co-pilot, Rebecca Shaw, screamed a scream so haunting that if you hear it, you'll never get it out of your head. A fraction of a second later, the aircraft plunged into a house and blew up in a ball of fire. All 49 people on board died, and a man on the ground was killed as well. This accident occurred on February 12, 2009. The investigation that was launched in response to the plane crash was done by the National Transportation Safety Board, and they found the probable cause to be pilot error. The pilots didn't respond the way they should have to stall warnings in the cockpit, so in the end, it wasn't the airplane's fault. The accident was caused by gross negligence on behalf of both pilots.
Okay, 2300 till established, clear for ILS 23 Cactus. 1452, and the ice is starting to come off the windscreen now.
AirAsia 8501. AirAsia Flight 8501 was an international flight on its way from Indonesia to Singapore on December 28, 2014. While the plane was airborne, it ran into some difficulties. These issues resulted in the plane crashing violently into the Java Sea, killing all 162 people on board. But despite the huge number of casualties, it was only the third deadliest aviation disaster in Indonesia. About a year after the incident, the National Transportation Safety Committee released a report detailing the cause for the disaster. They said it was the plane's rudder control system that motivated the captain to do a full reset of the flight control computers. He couldn't have known, but this wasn't the correct decision. The rudder was malfunctioning and something definitely needed to be done, but resetting the controls wasn't the right thing to do. In the brief time that the controls were turned off, the airplane stalled and made an uncontrolled descent directly into the ocean. There was also some miscommunication between the two pilots, which was captured on the black box recording. The audio from the cockpit is extremely disturbing. For the last few moments of the flight, there are mostly alarm bells going off. At exactly 11:13 p.m., the chimes start. Then the warning chimes are joined by the sound of a stall warning at 11:16 p.m. You can hear someone saying, "Pull down" 4 times in a row at 11:17 p.m., and after more alarms sound, someone can be heard repeating, "Slowly, slowly." Then the recording suddenly ends. American Airlines Flight 587. On November 12, 2001, American Airlines Flight 587 crashed into the residential neighborhood of Bell Harbor in Queens, New York City. It was a horrifying accident, especially since it came only 2 months after the devastating 9/11 terrorist attacks in September. The Airbus A300B4-605R shattered on impact and all 260 passengers were killed, along with 5 people on the ground. It became the second deadliest aviation catastrophe in American history after Flight 191 in 1979. In the minutes and hours after the flight, there was panic across the nation. Everyone knew a plane had crashed and there were fatalities, yet information was slow to come out. People thought another terrorist attack was imminent, and there was widespread panic. The National Transportation Safety Board released a statement saying the accident was caused by the first officer's aggressive overuse of the rudder controls. It had nothing at all to do with terrorism. The first officer was just hammering the control so hard that he stressed a vertical stabilizer, resulting in it separating completely from the aircraft. The intense forces also caused the 2 engines to separate and malfunction immediately before impact. The final words in the cockpit are unsettling to hear. There's a general panic when the pilots realize something awful is happening. You can hear them shouting out orders, and some loud thumps and bangs can be heard as well. Then there's the shrieking of alarms. Some of the pilots curse as another stall warning sounds, and then someone says, "Get out of it, get out of it." Those were, unfortunately, the pilot's last words as the plane smashed into the ground.
Get out of it! Get out of it!
Air Blue Flight 202. Air Blue Flight 202 was on its way from Karachi to Islamabad, Pakistan on July 28, 2010, but before the plane ever reached the capital city, it crashed into the northern Margala Hills. In total, 146 passengers and crew were killed, with no one left alive. This is still the worst air accident that ever occurred in Pakistan. It was also the first time an Airbus A321 was involved in a fatal crash. The accident was caused by the captain's arrogance during the flight. His horrible attitude caused the first officer to lose self-esteem and not question the captain's mistake. Weather conditions forced the plane to make an unusual approach to the airport in the capital city of Islamabad. They were supposed to fly around the airport while keeping a short distance before lining up with the runway, but the pilot drove the aircraft straight into the side of a mountain before he could get the plane in the right position to make a landing. The arrogance of the pilot can be heard in the disturbing cockpit voice recording. Captain Chowdhury deviated significantly from the procedures he was supposed to follow for the approach. He did it his own way and it resulted in disaster. At one point in the recording, you can even hear the captain laughing at the orders given to him by air traffic control. When the first officer tried to say something about establishing visual contact with the airport, the captain basically told him to mind his own business. Seconds later, the captain flies the plane straight into a wall of rock.
Let's make sure that we land.
Yes, Captain.
Do you see the airport?
Negative, Captain.
Right there. Airport in sight.
Airport in sight. Air Blue 202.
National Airlines Flight 102. Just moments after taking off on April 29, 2013, National Airlines Flight 102 crashed. This was a cargo flight between Camp Bastion in Afghanistan and Dubai with only 7 people on board. But because of improperly secured cargo that broke free, those 7 people lost their lives. The cargo broke loose and rolled through the back of the cargo hold before smashing through the bulkhead. The rear flight control system was totally destabilized by this, which meant the aircraft was uncontrollable, and there was absolutely nothing the pilots could do to recover. It was all over before it even started. The cargo that came loose wasn't your average cargo. It was 5 heavily armored vehicles that were loaded onto the airplane when it stopped to refuel. Then, when the plane took off from Bagram at 3:30 p.m., its nose rose too sharply and the cargo became loose, resulting in damage. The aircraft then exploded in a fireball before even getting off the runway. The vessel exploded at the end of the airfield, killing 4 pilots, 2 mechanics, and a loadmaster. The terrifying crash was caught on video by a dashcam on someone's car who happened to be driving by at the exact time of the accident. It's pretty horrifying to watch, especially when paired with the final audio from the cockpit. In the hour before the accident, the crew were discussing their concern over the heavy load. It's extremely obvious in the audio that they were uneasy about the restraints used on the vehicles. The first officer even told the captain one of the straps was busted, suggesting the load could break free at any time. The captain then says that's scary when talking to the loadmaster about how much the vehicles were moving in their restraints. Even though they were acutely aware of the possible danger they were in, nothing was done about it. So when the airplane took off, it crashed just seconds later. The Butcher Baker. Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker, was one of the most despicable villains the FBI ever tangled with. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, Robert turned the wild woods of Alaska into his own personal playground. He abducted adult entertainers and exotic dancers and would then let them loose in the remote wilderness, after which he'd proceed to hunt them like animals. His life growing up had been pretty miserable, which makes it easier to understand why he was the way he was. He was a social outcast who grew up paranoid that everyone was out to get him. He burned down a school bus garage in 1960, spent a couple of years in jail, and then fled the contiguous United States in 1967. He subsequently joined a small community in Alaska and opened up a bakery. He was arrested multiple times for assaulting and abducting women, but he always made bail and was released. Then, in 1973, he started kidnapping people and hunted them down in the woods. In 1983, over a decade after he'd moved to Alaska, a woman named Cindy Paulson escaped his wicked game. He'd kidnapped the 18-year-old girl and tortured her at his house. Then he prepared to load her into his plane and take her out to his cabin where he would hunt her. However, as he was preparing the plane, Cindy escaped and ran off. After she told her story to the police, the FBI got involved. FBI agent John Douglas put together a psychological profile of the killer, which eventually led them to Robert Hansen, who confessed to murdering 17 women over 12 years. As a punishment for his horrific actions, he was given 461 years in prison. He served his time at the Spring Creek Correctional Center, located in Seward, Alaska, where he passed away in 2014. The Alcatraz escapees. The U.S. Marshals Service recently released updated renderings of 3 fugitives who escaped Alcatraz on June 11, 1962. These new renderings show what the escapees would look like if they were still alive today, even though they'd be in their 90s by now. The FBI has been looking into the case for over 40 years, and still there's no real hope of ever tracking down the 3 men who managed to break out of Alcatraz. These criminals are Frank Morris, John Anglin, and John's brother, Clarence Anglin. All 3 of them created fake heads to make it look like they were still sleeping and tunneled through the solid concrete walls of their cells. They then escaped Alcatraz Island and paddled away into the night on a raft made from prison raincoats. They were the only men to ever successfully escape Alcatraz without getting caught. These days, their escape is one of the FBI's biggest failures. Countless tips regarding the missing men have come in over the past 60 years. A raft was allegedly discovered after the escape, and 3 men were spotted stealing a car that same night. But even with all the information and tips, the FBI never managed to track them down. The Anglin brothers were supposedly photographed at a bar in Brazil in 1975, but that was the closest anyone ever came to seeing the 3 fugitives alive. John Dillinger. John Dillinger was one of the first criminals ever hunted by the FBI. His infamy began on May 10, 1933, after he'd just finished serving nearly 9 years in prison and immediately went to rob a bank in Bluffton, Ohio. John was arrested by Dayton police on September 22nd and was subsequently booked into the county jail in Lima, where he'd wait for his trial. Days later, 8 of John's pals broke out of the Indiana State Prison and killed 2 guards in the process before showing up at the Lima jail. They shot the sheriff and beat him to death, and then they stole the keys to John's cell in order to free him. From there, the crew went on an insane spree of terror that lasted until July of 1934. They killed 10 men, robbed multiple banks, and staged a total of 3 jailbreaks. The crew only got busted on January 23, 1934, because a fire started at the hotel they were staying at. Firemen recognized the criminals from their photographs, and John Dillinger was arrested, and so too were 3 other men in his gang. John was taken to the county jail in Crown Point, Indiana, but apparently no cell could hold him, and he once again broke free and ran away, forcing the FBI to get involved. The FBI launched a manhunt as John continued robbing banks throughout the country. There were multiple shootouts between the criminal and law enforcement, but John got away every time. It wasn't until July 22, 1934 that they finally cornered him. John was sold out by a madam of a brothel named Anna Campanas. Anna was in the middle of being deported back to Romania and was willing to trade information in order to stay in the US. She told the FBI exactly where to find John, and the agents cornered him as he left a movie theater in Chicago. They tried to take him peacefully, but John pulled out a pistol and started shooting. 3 FBI agents shot him, though, and he fell to the pavement and bled to death. The Unabomber. On May 25, 1978, a package that was delivered to the Northwestern University of Evanston, Illinois, exploded. Over the next 17 years, 15 more bombings would occur in the United States of America. 3 people were killed, and many others were injured as the FBI tried desperately to track down a man known only as the Unabomber. It was in 1995 that FBI criminal profiler James R. Fitzgerald started working on the case. The FBI at the time considered the Unabomber a criminal mastermind, someone who went through great lengths not to get caught. He ripped the skin off batteries so they couldn't be traced, and he even made his own glue by melting down deer hooves. He also never left any trace of DNA or fingerprints. The Unabomber started sending letters to the media and to his victims in the early 1990s. Then, in 1995, he sent his manifesto to the biggest papers in the country. His view was that society should be erased, technology should stop, and people should go back to living in tribes made up of hunters and gatherers. Fitzgerald used a manifesto to help build a profile that ultimately led them to Ted Kaczynski in 1996. Fitzgerald was able to get into Kaczynski's head and realized he was likely a loner, someone who lived in isolation far from civilization. They eventually tracked Ted Kaczynski to a cabin in Montana where he was living as a hermit. Kaczynski pleaded guilty to the bombings in 1998 and was sentenced to life in prison as a result. We wanted to give a big thank you to Leanna, Ellie, and Scorpion for supporting this channel. We love your feedback. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the channel and join the family. Durkin. The first FBI agent ever killed in the line of duty was Edwin C. Shanahan, who was shot dead on October 11, 1925. Special Agent Shanahan was killed as he was trying to apprehend the automobile thief, Martin James Durkin. Durkin already had an extensive criminal record. He previously shot 3 policemen in Chicago and a 4th officer in California. He had a reputation as a desperate gunman who would kill any authority who tried to stop him. Edwin Shanahan received information that Durkin was expected at a garage in Chicago with a stolen automobile that he'd brought up from New Mexico. The agent and local police descended on the garage and waited for Durkin. However, after many hours passed, they decided the information was bogus. The officers left, but Shanahan remained fixed on the garage, hoping that at some point Durkin would show up. And he did, but not until all the officers had left. Shanahan tried to take on Durkin by himself, but was shot straight to the chest with a revolver. This resulted in a cross-country manhunt. The FBI had lost one of their own, and they were absolutely furious. They finally managed to track Durkin to the railroad, but he'd already boarded Southern Pacific train number 110, bound for St. Louis, Missouri. Special agents with the FBI learned he was in the stateroom car with a mysterious woman and would be arriving at 11 in the morning. So the FBI had the train stopped just outside a small town before it could reach the city. That way the murderer had nowhere to run if he escaped. The train was surrounded, and Durkin was eventually dragged out of the stateroom. The criminal was then handcuffed before he could even reach for his gun. Durkin went to jail in 1926, but was released in 1954 at the age of 53. He passed away 27 years later, in 1981. James Eddie Diggs. James Eddie Diggs was allegedly a normal, happy, regular kind of guy. He worked as a mechanic at a naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. He was a family man who was a respected member of his community, and his neighbors described him as a hard-working individual. And yet, at 7 a.m. on May 26, 1949, James shot his wife Ruth and murdered their 2 young sons, James Jr. and Alfonso. After the unprovoked killings, James went on the run. On May 31st, he was identified in North Carolina, where he was pulled over by law enforcement. He then shot Officer Rex Howell, critically wounding him, and then vanished without a trace. That was the last time James was ever seen, and to this day he remains on the most wanted list of the FBI. But even all these years later, nobody knows why James suddenly killed his family, or what his motivation may have been. He's been on the run for over 70 years, and at this point, he's likely already dead. What do you think caused James Eddie Diggs to kill his wife and children? Let us know in the comments. Eduardo Ravello. Eduardo Ravello was once on the FBI's most wanted list. He's a Mexican-American gangster who used to be the head of the Barrio Ateca gang. He earned the position of gang leader by betraying his old boss. In 2008, he shot the leader of the gang in the neck and stabbed him several times. Eduardo then took over the group, and these weren't the kind of people you'd want to mess around with. They allegedly operated as hitmen for the Mexican drug cartels. There are about 600 active members of the gang that still murder, extort, kidnap, and participate in every other crime you can think of. The gang members are also prevalent in many prisons across America and Mexico. In 2017, the FBI was seeking help in capturing Eduardo. They offered $100,000 for any information that would lead to an arrest. They were desperate for help because Eduardo was wanted in connection to murdering a pregnant U.S. consulate employee, her husband, and the husband of another consulate worker. Leslie Enriquez was 4 months pregnant when she was shot to death on March 13, 2010. Her husband Arthur was also killed, along with Jorge Alberto Salcido Ceniceros. The murders were performed at the behest of Eduardo. Thankfully, the FBI announced that the gangster was captured in June of 2018, following a police raid in Mexico. So far as we know, he's still behind bars. Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph was born in Merritt Island, Florida, on September 19, 1966. He served briefly in the U.S. Army, then worked as a carpenter. But he later went on to become a murderer. He was responsible for the devastating bombing at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. On July 27th, Eric detonated a 40-pound, 18-kilogram pipe bomb at the Centennial Olympic Park. 2 people were killed as a result, and over 100 others were injured. This was only the start of Eric's killing spree. On January 16, 1997, a pair of bombs went off at a clinic that performed abortions, subsequently wounding 7 people. The month after, a bomb exploded at a nightclub in Atlanta, injuring 4 people. Then, on January 29, 1998, a woman's health clinic in Birmingham, Alabama was targeted. A bomb blew up, killing 1 security guard and critically injuring a nurse. It took 4 bombings for the FBI to finally identify Eric Rudolph as their main suspect, and it was only because somebody spotted his pickup truck near the clinic right before the bomb exploded. Authorities launched a manhunt, but Eric was nowhere to be found. He remained on the FBI's most wanted list from between 1998 and 2003, and in the end, he wasn't even caught by the FBI. A rookie police officer ended up discovering Eric digging through a dumpster in the town of Murphy, North Carolina. All that time on the run had depleted Eric's funds, and he was starving. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 4 life terms, and is currently at the Supermax Federal Prison in Florence. Michael Tevis. Michael Tevis made a fortune in the 1970s through peep show machines. They called him the Sultan of Smut, and for good reason. Michael boasted that 99% of the adult magazines and films sold in America moved through his warehouse. He also had his own factory in Atlanta, in which he manufactured a revolutionary new machine. It was kind of like a jukebox, but for risque content. It was an 8mm projector that played erotic films on a 15-second loop. Michael leased these machines to adult bookstores, where they went into private booths and were fed quarters by millions of men who had no access to the internet. The invention apparently made Michael an estimated $2 billion. However, Michael had some competition from a man named Kenneth Hanna, so Michael invited Kenneth to his warehouse to talk about business opportunities. Once they were there, he pulled out a pistol and shot Kenneth 3 times in the chest. Somehow Kenneth survived this attempt on his life, forcing Michael to shoot him execution style. This was all because Michael had heard that Kenneth was ripping off his idea and was trying to profit off of his smut machines. Michael got away with the killing until 1978, when he was snitched on by a former employee. He was charged with murder, but he managed to escape from his jail cell in New Albany, Indiana later that same year. He went on the run, but was tracked down by the FBI. They apprehended him a few months later in November, while he was attempting to take cash out of a bank under a fake identity in Connecticut. Billy Bryant. In April of 1968, Billy Bryant was sentenced to 54 years in prison for bank robbery and assault. By August of that same year, he'd escaped his incarceration at the Corrections Reformatory in Lorton, Virginia, and was on the run. Billy stole a vehicle he'd been working on at the automobile shop inside the reformatory, then drove it through a chain-link gate and took off. The FBI immediately tried to track Billy down. However, things didn't go the way they should have. Billy robbed a bank on January 8, 1969, but FBI agents caught up to Billy at his wife's house, not far from the bank he'd just robbed. When they knocked on the door, Billy shot all 3 agents at point-blank range and then slammed the door shut. One of the agents survived the brutal attack, but Edwin R. Woodruff and Anthony Palmisano were pronounced dead upon their arrival at the hospital. Agents and police surrounded the house, but Billy was long gone. He'd scrambled out an upper window and escaped down a tree. The police then received a call from a concerned citizen that somebody was in their attic. It turned out Billy had broken into someone else's house and barricaded himself in their attic, thinking he could wait out the police there. However, the homeowner heard all the racket and called the police. The FBI showed up, and Billy Bryant was then dragged back to jail. He was only on the FBI's most wanted list for 2 hours before being caught. Which of the FBI's most terrifying criminals do you think was the worst? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.